So they say that history begins with writing and, with monarchies and kings and with war. But history's real starting line, I believe, was with a seed. So we didn't choose agriculture because it was better. I think human beings chose agriculture because it produced more and then ultimately it trapped us. What if the greatest revolution in human history wasn't fire or iron or empire, but farming? So this is not a tool and not necessarily an idea, but a trap. And it's a trap inside a field of grain. So this is the story of how farming built civilization and how it broke humanity at the same time. So this is the agricultural singularity. So what came before agriculture, before civilization? So before wheat and before rice and barley, before borders and wars and kings, we were hunter gatherers. So we lived in small bands, small groups, moved through the seasons, and ate hundreds of plants and proteins. We also worked fewer hours than modern people and had relatively equal gender roles. And we were also animist, which basically means we believed in spirits, nature, dreams. There was no dogma, no ideology. There was always conflict, but it was low intensity conflict, and warfare was rare, and there wasn't any genocide, as far as I know. And we were also, I guess, amateur botanists, right? We had deep ecological knowledge of plants and cycles and animal behavior and weather patterns and climate and so forth. At the same time, since we were hunter gatherers and I guess you could say nomadic, we had mobility, which obviously equals adaptability. And that means you can move when, disaster strikes. So if there's, what climate conditions that change or flooding or things of that sort, you can move faster. Now, they didn't have armies because, again, they didn't have borders. And we lived lightly, not just on the land, but in the mind as well. Another thing, too, to consider is gender roles in pre agricultural societies. Women were very active participants in survival because gathering wasn't secondary. It often provided the majority of the calorie intake. So think of it this way: the majority of just hunter-gatherer diets and pre-agriculture era consisted of, shrubs and wild berries, wild mushrooms, and small game and things of this sort. And apparently, the average work day, if you will, in collecting was approximately 3 hours, and it left the rest of the day just to, I guess, partake in whatever else they were doing. So women were vital for this role, or everyone was vital for this role, because the more you could collect as a community, the more calories you get. So, and also in many groups, women also hunted, tracked, and defended. And there's plenty of examples of this in obviously more modern nomadic societies. So, for example, if you look at our recent history, so look at the Scythians, right? These were a nomadic warrior culture. And there's archaeological findings also show female warriors buried with their weapons. Or in Mongol society, ancient Mongols, right? The elite women rode on horseback and practiced archery and managed camps, and in some cases even commanded troops in battle. So you have, again, people like the Sarmatians, the Turkic tribes, the mythic, Amazons, right? Some of it's rooted in fact. Native Americans of the Plain tribes, and all these societies, they show high female agency in mobile societies. So before the plow, the bow didn't care who held it. We didn't conquer the earth. We belonged to it together. Now, this revolution wasn't overnight. So again, around 10,000 BCE, the ice age ends and our climate stabilizes, and then the human population rises. So you have people in the Fertile Crescent who begin planting wheat and barley. So think of like, you know, the Nile, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, right? These biblical rivers where civilization started to sprout. So, for example, in China, they started planting rice and millet. In the Andes, it was potatoes and yamas. In Africa, obviously, they had yams and sorghum. And in New Guinea, it was taro and bananas. So agriculture didn't start in one place; it erupted like pressure building under the crust of humanity, if you will, right? And it just happened in different places at different times, and they planted different things that were available based on their environment. And why did they do this? It's not because it was easier, but because it supported more people. So once we began growing food, we couldn't go back. And we obviously started domesticating animals. That followed, which provided, labor, milk, meat, and of course, disease. Now, early farmers were shorter, more prone to tooth decay, and had worse bone density. So, like grain-based diets, meaning higher carb diets, and lower nutrients. So we got more mouths and less to feed them with, if you will. Now, what happens with surpluses? So farming creates surplus, food you can store. And that food that you can store, that changes everything because a surplus equates to power, and power equals protection. And if you're going to protect something or source out that protection, that equals hierarchy. So now we have landowners, we have, which is the elite class, and we have the warriors and the priest, and then the peasant. So now we have a social caste system, if you will, or a class system. At this point now, the wealth could be hoarded, and taxes began as grain collection. So now you have to account for these things, right? So now you form bureaucracies, and they're formed to measure, guard, and distribute these resources. And of course, with that comes debt and enslavement. These things emerge as well for those who couldn't pay tribute. So before we were egalitarian societies, we used to share, and now we taxed. And we used to migrate, and now we fenced in because obviously, if you're growing the food, it doesn't grow overnight. So you have to sit there. You can't migrate anymore. You can't be nomadic anymore, free, if you will. Now you're forced to protect the land you're farming on. So we didn't just invent farming, we invented inequality. And the rich didn't work the land, they owned it. Now, this also affects obviously many other facets of human society. Things like belief in gods and religions and the patriarchy and things of this sort. So let's start with agriculture didn't just change economics, it changed, again, beliefs. So fertility cults essentially became sky gods, and the shamans became priests. And calendars, rituals, and harvest festivals, religion now controlled nature. And writing was invented for grain ledger and tax records, just to see how much you have. And the temples became the banks. And the patriarchy rose from the desire to control land and inheritance. So farming didn't just plant seeds in the soil, it planted seeds in the mind. And before agriculture, belief systems, again, were animistic, right? They believed in spirits in the trees and rivers and animals. And the gods were immediate, living in the thunder, the river, in the hunt. There was no hierarchies between gods and none between people, as far as I'm concerned. But again, when we settled, when the land mattered more than the mobility, when property was passed through bloodlines, our gods changed too. So we needed gods who defended ownership not flow. We needed sky gods, kings of kings, and lawgivers. And again, fertility cults became these rigid priesthoods. And again, you hear things like the sacred feminine, right? The wild womb of earth. That was demoted to a vessel. And temples stopped being a place to connect with nature and became vaults to own it. Writing was born, but it wasn't born for, poetry or prayers. Original writing, it was born to count grains, debt, and taxes. Religion became a tool of management, and to put an analogy, a sacred ledger written in myths and blood. Now, the patriarchy, right? And these control lineages. So before the plow, again, women rode horses, hunted, traded, commanded. The lineage was fluid, and it was mostly based on capability, not inheritance. But after the plow and farming, right, land became legacy, bloodlines became contracts, and women became wombs to produce heirs. So we went essentially from honoring the earth as a mother to ruling her as a father. And men needed certainty over paternity, over who would inherit the land, the livestock, the lineage. And to control that, they needed to control women. So marriage became a contract and virginity became property. So at this point, women's freedom became a threat to economic stability. So we essentially replaced the wild hunter with the landowner. We replaced the shamans with the priest, and we replaced the mother with the patriarch. To me, the price of civilization wasn't just taxes. It was blood and teeth. So think of like grain heavy diets. Um, they've done anthropological studies on this and, archaeological findings. You'll see malnutrition, tooth decay, and stunted growth. And of course, living with animals, as it's been duly noted, equals disease. Think of smallpox, the flu, measles. Obviously, once you have villages that turn to towns, that turns to cities, to societies, right? Crowded cities, that equals plagues. And when you have resources surplus, that equals, invasion targets. And once you're being invaded, militarization begins. So now you have to build walls and weapons and armies and conquest. The plow made the sword possible. The farm, that is what birthed the state. And the farm didn't just grow food, it grew empire. Children became labor, and war became policy. And freedom, I think we traded freedom for food. And yeah, we got cities, we got kings, we got history, but we lost something deeper, a, a memory of wilderness or of wildness, a rhythm that we can't hear anymore. So agriculture changed the human condition. So we went from fluid tribes to fixed classes, from sacred cycles to profit margins, and from a shared earth to owned property. But it also gave us everything. It gave us cities, it gave us science, it gave us civilization. But it also cost us everything that we used to be. So the first revolution wasn't fire and it wasn't metal. Again, it was the seed. And we've been harvesting it since forever. And we inherited its consequences ever since. We planted grains, but it was the hierarchy that grew the tallest. So I hope this was informative. Let me see if I can post some links and sources to all this information because I didn't conjecture this myself, guys. But again, like always, remember to lift more, eat more, rest more, love more, and hate less. Thank you, guys.